Now, more than ever, we need an opportunity to have conversations, to listen to each other, to talk with one another, to stay involved. Seattle City Club creates ways for you to get connected, stay informed, and be engaged. Guide your community toward the change you want to see. During the pandemic, Seattle City Club adapted to ensure programs were more accessible to broader and diverse audiences. COVID cannot stop conversation. It's the connection we need. Democracy starts with you.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Whitney Keys, and I'm the Executive Director of Seattle City Club, and I just want to welcome you to our 2020 Year in Review. Over the past 12 remarkable months, we haven't skipped a beat when it comes to creating informative, connecting, and engaging programs around civics. And during this time, I've had the chance to meet with many people, as many as possible, virtually, including some of you that are here today. And I've learned that you are college students, you're starting to find your first job, you might be mid-career, and many of you are actually very active in retirement. And when it comes to age, gender, race, geographic location, political persuasion, education, family situation, personal interests, and more, you're all unique. But one thing that I found through every conversation that I've had are that we have some shared values. And first, the thing that you've told me the most is that you value dialogue across differences. You want to hear different voices and diverse perspectives, like we did last month with our civic cocktail program, where we invited Republican Rob McKenna and Democrat Marilyn Strickland to have a civil conversation about the results of the election. And guess what? They did it. And we even had some laughs along the way. Now, let me be clear. Seattle City Club is not about just bringing together two political parties. Our programs include all types of leaders and subject matter experts, and we look at issues from multiple sides in ways that foster respectful debate and idea exchange. Another thing that you told me is that you value civic engagement and education. And I know engagement seems hard these days when we're doing programs like this virtually. We can't shake hands with someone new that we've met at the coat rack, and we can't give a dear friend a hug or a pat on the back before we sit down. But we're still connected because engagement comes in many different forms. The past few months, we've hosted several virtual civic boot camps that bring people together for intimate conversations with local leaders about critical topics like the environment, racial equity, and even how our local government works. These one-of-a-kind opportunities are all about connecting and engaging and increasing our civic knowledge. Finally, you told me that you value access and inclusion. And let me tell you that in developing and delivering all of our programs, we have kept this top of mind. Whether that is including a person living with a disability or someone living in another part of our state, like Friday Harbor or Newport or Wenatchee or Kelso. Through our Washington State Debate Coalition this year, we teamed up with TVW down in Olympia and media partners around the state to host the only televised gubernatorial and lieutenant governor debates. We reached well over 1 million people, ensuring that they had access to these potential leaders before the election. Now, I haven't had the chance to talk with all of you yet, so I'd like to pause for a moment and get your input. And to do that, we're going to put a quick poll up on the screen, so you should see a few questions. And what I'd like to know is, which of these do you value the most? Access and inclusion, engagement and education, or dialogue across differences? And I'd like you to go ahead and click the one that most resonates with you. And then as we're gathering the results, we can talk about them. I do want you to know that this is great timing because we're putting together our 2021 calendar of programs, and I'd love to get your feedback. So I'm hoping that that's given you all enough time to weigh in. Let's go ahead and see those results. Oh, this is fascinating. So we're pretty spread across. It looks like engagement and education is kind of making the rounds as most valued by all of you, followed by dialogue across differences, and then access and inclusion. Well, I can tell you that we're committed to all three of these, and we're going to continue to do this and infuse this into our programming. And the only way we can do that is by your generous support. And so I want to start off by thanking our annual partners and year in review sponsors. And they include Boeing, Puget Sound Energy, Amazon, and Davis Wright Tremaine. And I have to thank Comcast. They have been a phenomenal partner of ours. They have given us continued support, and they've helped countless times this year going beyond their original commitment. And a final thanks goes to AARP, Alaska Airlines, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, BNSF Railway, Lane Powell, Fred Hutch, Echo Northwest, Columbia Bank, Seattle University, Virginia Mason, and Pemco Insurance. Now, I've got to thank my fantastic board, and there are a number of the members here today. I tried to acknowledge a few in the chat, but I appreciate all of you being here. All right, well, let's get this program started. I am thrilled to introduce our moderator, Angela King. I listen to her just about every weekday on KOW's morning news program. She is an Emmy Award-winning journalist. She's a University of Washington graduate, and she's been a part of our news scene here in our region since the 1990s. So Angela, welcome, and we look forward to this program with you.
Whitney, thank you so very much, and a big thanks to Seattle City Club as we reflect on this year in review. 2020. I mean, really, what more do I need to say? I think we all have our one word for the year, so I'm going to go ahead and let you fill in the blank in your mind. But today we've come together so we can bring all of those words together, those emotions, those thoughts, everything that we've had to deal with this past year, and reflect on a year that, to be quite frank, a lot of people are very eager to turn the page on. But then again, there have been some major milestones, some major bookmarks over the past 12 months. It's been a year filled with demands. Some we've heard chapter on verse before. Some of those were met, many were not. From racial justice to the environment, politics, the economy, and of course, COVID-19. So my question is, we had so many tests on so many different levels. How did we do? Better yet, what's next? Although I must say, my boss once said in a previous staff meeting, maybe we should stop asking that question in 2020. But now that it's almost done, I think we're safe to reflect and ask what is next as we approach the new year. Now, to help us navigate the paths that lay before us, we have compiled and gathered together an incredible panel of some of the most respected experts in their field. But before I introduce the panel, I have some housekeeping items we need to take care of. The chat box, as you may notice, is open right now, but we're going to close it once the panel gets started, so it's not as much of a distraction. We will reopen it once our panel discussion is over. But one thing that will remain open is the question and answer box, the Q&A box. Go ahead and leave your questions for our experts there. I will do my best to get to them as quickly and as accurately as I can, but like 2020, the show is jam-packed. We're going to start things off with some questions for our panelists, and here's some of their predictions for 2021. And in between, I'm going to ask a series of what we call rapid response. That's where I will present a subject matter to our panelists, and they will tell us the first things that come to their mind. And I'll do my best as well to give you a heads up as to what topics we're going to be discussing, so you can submit your questions once again in the Q&A box. But right now, I think it's time to introduce you to our panel of experts. First off, and we will introduce them in alphabetical order. Dr. Vin Gupta is an affiliate associate professor at the University of Washington's Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation. He's also a medical correspondent for MSNBC and NBC News. Dr. Gupta has been at the forefront of the COVID-19 response, and he has been treating patients since the early days of the pandemic. He has a strong background in public health focused on epidemic preparedness. Our next panelist is Alyssa Macy. She is the CEO of the Washington Environmental Council and the Washington Conservation Voters. She's also served her nation, the Confederated Tribes of Warm Springs in Oregon, as the Chief Operations Officer and co-authored the first ever national report on Native American voting in the year 2005. We also understand she's been a foster parent to 6 children. What a job. Lola Peters is an author and poet. Her works include a book of essays entitled The Truth About White People. We're going to be truthful throughout this conversation. She's also a columnist for crosscut.com, editor at large, and columnist for the South Seattle Emerald. Ms. Peters is a proud member of the Seattle African Americans Writers Alliance and the Seattle Association of Black Journalists. John Scholes has been the president and CEO of the Downtown Seattle Association since 2014 and previously served as the group's vice president of advocacy and economic development. John's also a member of the board of Visit Seattle, the International Downtown Association, Transportation Choice Coalition, and the Downtown Emergency Services Center. I want to thank you all for your time and your willingness to field some questions, not only from me, but from our audience. Lots of questions out there. It was a big year. Now, to start things off, I'm going to ask each of you, in the order that I introduced you alphabetically, to give me 2 defining moments of 2020. What are the 2 key moments that stood out the most to you for this year? Dr. GUPTA, I begin with you.
Oh gosh, I would say the first, and thank you, by the way, for having me. This is an honor. The first was notification that there was, in early February, actually in early January and then into February, that a novel coronavirus that seemed like it was quite lethal had reached our shores, specifically here in the Pacific Northwest, and wondering whether or not we were, how widespread the epidemic was. And that's number one. Number two, I would say that we don't talk enough about this, but perhaps the greatest public health intervention that occurred in King County was our largest employers actually taking the charge nationwide here in the city of Seattle and encouraging telework. And one wonders what things would have looked like if that did not occur. And so those were the 2 biggest surprises to me in 2020.
All right. Important points. I think we can all relate to those. Alyssa, your take on the 2 big issues of 2020.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here today. The first thing that comes to mind is the murder of George Floyd. I happened to be in Minneapolis when that occurred, and that weeks following his murder and the senseless loss of life was something that just impacted me in a way that I've never experienced before. One, it was awful to see that broadcast across the nation. But more importantly, it was the pain that the community was feeling, not just there, but everywhere. So that was an extremely impactful thing that happened to me this year. The second thing that lingers in my mind at all times is what happened here in Washington. In 72 hours in September, 600,000 acres burned here in the state. That's 500,000 football fields. That's 2,000 Seward parks. It was 5 times larger than the area of burn in 2019. And we saw that here in Seattle through the smoke. And the one thing, our one way of, I think, finding a little bit of respite in all of what's happening in this year with the global pandemic was to go outside, and that was taken away from us. And that really just sticks in my head as well as an impactful moment this year.
Yes, and those were very key moments we can all relate to. You being there specifically in Minneapolis following the death of George Floyd. I'm sure that had to be an incredible time. The wildfires as well. Lola, your take. What were the big 2 takeaway stories from 2020 for you?
It's a hard nut to crack. There were so many. I think the most impactful moment for me was watching Converge Media's live stream of the protests at the 3rd Precinct. And that pink umbrella moment, I mean, it's so iconic that it actually has a name, right? I think that moment was really quite profound in that the next day when the police chief and the mayor all told one narrative, and thousands of us had seen a completely different event than what they were talking about. I think that was a really dramatic moment for me, where we actually could see the documentation between reality and what was being presented to the public. The other thing is COVID. I mean, COVID is such a big thing. It's such a huge thing. And I'm one of those people who was sick in early January and did not know that that's what I was sick with until much later, and until it wouldn't go away. And then the doctor finally went, you know what I think this is? And so I think those two things and the response of our region, I am so proud of our governor and the courageous things that he's done against other people's passions. But he still had he has a moral center that's made him stand his ground, if you will, on protecting the people in our state. So those are the two things that I think really, really stand out for me. The courage of the governor and the disconnect between what we are told and what actually happened on the ground during the protests.
John Scholes, Downtown Seattle Association, top 2 issues in 2020 for you.
First, thanks for moderating today, Angela, and thanks to CityClub for putting on this event and all the great programming that you're bringing to our community virtually. For me, I pick up a bit on one of Dr. Gupta's moments, March 5th, when tens of thousands of employees began working from home in downtown Seattle, but really across King County. The level of communication and collaboration that went into those decisions between the private sector and public sector, I think was really critical. And I was downtown and I saw those streets get empty real fast and the restaurants and bars empty out. It was shocking how quickly that decision was made, rightly so. And we were an employer on March 5th that also began working from home. And I think it's important to remember that at that moment, we were still having events. There were still sporting events. There was lots of other things that were going on in our community. And that was really the first big move that we made collectively as a community to begin to slow the spread of coronavirus. And I think it was an appropriate one that saved hundreds, if not thousands of lives. My second moment would be Saturday, November 7th, when Joe Biden was declared president-elect. I think we will look back years from now and perhaps remember that more than many others as a significant defining moment for our country. So those were my two.
All right. Second quick question. What did you change your mind about in 2020? Dr. Gupta.
You know, I changed my mind about how I've always been an incrementalist when it comes to change, recognizing, for example, in healthcare that we've been at reform for 80 years since the Truman administration. We haven't gotten it right. That incrementalism is the only way forward in American politics to get real change, but it's going to be slow. I changed my mind about that. And I am absolutely, even though I'm a pragmatist, really believe we need transformative change, healthcare for all, in whatever formulation that takes, we need it now. Because I care, still to this day, the patients I care for are the ones who have delayed diagnosis in COVID-19, primarily because they didn't have access to care. And so there is really no time to wait. And I think this pandemic has unearthed the urgency that I previously would recognize, but now really believe that there is no other option and incrementalism won't work.
Alyssa, what did you change your mind about?
Well, first of all, I want to say yes to what Dr. Gupta said. That is absolutely true. For me, it was about stepping into my power. There has been a lot of challenges for Brown and Black folks who work in the environmental movement in whatever capacity about whether we're believed, whether we're respected of our opinions, whether we bring value. And there have been situations where that has been the case. We haven't been listened to, we haven't been heard. And this year has given permission for a lot of us to say, this is what we believe, this is why. And there are many of us that believe this. And it took away a lot of that fear of feeling like perhaps you were the only one, or that you were alone in this struggle. And for me, that has been a really important growth edge for me in 2020, to not be malicious in what I'm saying, but to be very truthful and to be vulnerable. And that has been a power that I think a lot of people of color haven't been able to step into because it hasn't been safe. Now I know there are so many other people out there that believe in the same thing that I do, that we are committed and we're fierce and we're smart and we can make impact, and that we have each other to lean on. And I think that has been really amazing, that those connections are being made around the work that we're doing in a time where we feel so disconnected, that we're reaching out and we are embracing each other from afar. And that has been a really beautiful thing. And I'm just really thankful in many ways that for the gifts that have come out of 2020, that is one thing that I look at as a gift, that a lot of us just said, you know what? Now's the time to be fierce. Now's the time to be powerful. Now's the time to say the hard things, to have the hard discussions. And I feel safe enough to be able to do that.
Lola, what did you change your mind about?
Yes to both of them. I agree with both of you, especially Dr. Gupta. Absolutely, this is not a time for incrementalism. And I think that probably the biggest challenge in my mind has been about how do we look at things like the need for broadband access in our region. We have talked about, well, do we need to have municipally owned broadband, or do we need to just continue to have different contracts with the providers that we have? And I'm moving even further, even further into the thought that, this is really a utility. We really do need all of us to have access, to have the ability to go online for our jobs, for our schools, for everything. So I'm thinking rather than, I guess the way I changed my mind is, rather than moving to complete broadband for all services, that we need to identify what services are utilities related to the internet, and somehow come to a way to create that for our community, because it's not working the way it is right now. It really isn't. We're relying on the generosity of private companies, and they have other agendas. So we need to really think about that in a different way.
Such deep reflection, such a busy year. John, quickly, what did you change your mind about?
I changed my mind about my role as a leader in addressing systemic racism and diversity, equity, inclusion, both in the community and in my own organization. This has not been a strength of mine as a leader, historically not been a strength of ours as an organization. And so I've tried to spend time listening, learning, reading some of the great columns that Lola has written over the summer, making new connections and building my own awareness so I can be a more effective leader, starting first with my leadership of our organization, but also within the community.
All right. Well, forgive me as we have to just zoom through, because there's just so much to cover, so much to talk about, so many raw emotions about everything we've experienced as a collective group. Lots of big news out of Seattle over the past 24 hours. Seattle Mayor Jenny Durkan announcing she's not seeking re-election. The SPD being held in contempt of court for using pepper spray and blast balls on peaceful Black Lives Matter demonstrators over the summer. We are going to get to those things in just a bit, but first, one of the big stories of the day, the COVID-19 vaccine by Pfizer and BioNTech is now being administered in the UK. We're still waiting for FDA approval here, but Dr. Gupta, I want to begin with you. And just so our audience know, he is a man in demand. He may have to leave us early, but we want to thank you for your time right now because we really depend on your expertise. This has been a year filled with broken records daily, broken hearts. Our frontline healthcare workers have been pushed to the max. But are we really at the finish line with these vaccines?
I could talk for the next 40 minutes on this, so I'll try to keep this really concise. This is what I'll say. Relief is in the medium-term horizon. So March, April timeframe, if you're in the general population category, if you don't meet a high risk, if you don't have a high risk pre-existing condition, if you're not over 65 or an essential frontline worker per the definitions that the CDC have identified, you're probably going to get a vaccine in that time frame, and you can probably start to plan a summer vacation in August, maybe early fall. So there's relief. Let me just be clear from our models here at the Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation that any vaccine rollout strategy is not a panacea for what's happening in the next few months. We still expect, unfortunately, over 500,000 American souls lost from this pandemic and potentially more, irrespective of a vaccine strategy. That number can be mitigated, but people, they can't travel. Too often I see the mentality that we're okay, it's the next person that's not okay. And that needs to go away. I can't tell you how many conversations I'm having right now with friends who have loved ones in ICUs where they got the virus inadvertently from somebody who traveled, maybe before Thanksgiving. So we're all at risk, either directly or indirectly. We have to have that mindset for the next few months before relief.
All right, Alyssa, distribution is a big concern, especially when it comes to reaching our rural communities. I'm sure it's something you can understand and convey to our listeners as being a member of the Warm Springs Confederated Tribes. But I also want to know what recent rollbacks in environmental policy have you seen this year that concerns you specifically as it relates to the pandemic?
Yeah, well, the state is in a budget crisis, and the natural resources work takes up a very small amount of the overall state budget. And as we look to fill the gap, we are concerned about potential impacts on programs that serve communities. And I think we need to be very mindful of not rolling back environmental progress as we move forward. I don't think this is an either or, I think this is an and. And so I think a lot about what's coming into the state legislature, our work that starts up in January. I am all for making sure we take care of people. That is really important. But we also need to make sure that we take care of the environment because we are so interconnected to it. And if anything, this year has reminded us, shown us, given us opportunity to re-engage with nature, to be outside. As we know, state parks in Washington were completely full over the summertime because everybody was camping. I couldn't find anything like camping supplies that I was looking for. Had a hard time finding them because everybody was out. So I worry about what comes next as we look for revenue and how that will impact environmental programs that are currently in existence. And I think it's really important for us to always look at what people of color and impacted communities are saying. The Environmental Justice Task Force has come out with a report. There are a number of policy recommendations in that report that we need to be considering and figuring out how we resource it. Because again, as Dr. Gupta said, incremental progress is not going to be how we get somewhere. We have to be bold and transformative in this time. And so for me, I'm just watching and waiting to see how this will play out in the state legislature moving forward.
Well, Alyssa, you brought up communities of color. That leads me to my COVID question for you, Lola. There's a lot of what's been coined as vaccine skepticism, whether it's based on the more recent anti-vaxxer movement or a deep-seated and historical distrust of their government. There are some interactions that still haunt communities of color. What are you expecting from leadership to do to help these populations who are more likely to contract COVID, die of COVID-19, while battling the skepticism?
Good question. Wow. I think there are layers of leadership. So I think, there is the overall societal leadership, if you will. We have our governor and our senators and all those folks. But I think there's a different layer of leadership. That's community leadership. And, there are a lot of communities within communities of color. One of the challenges is to reach into all aspects of those communities. And I think it's going to take a lot more than reassurance. When you look at the history of things like the Tuskegee experiment, where not only were there were the physicians who were involved telling the community, oh no, this is safe, this is for your best interest. There were at every layer of community responsibility and accountability, there wasn't any. And so I think it's going to take a lot. I think I love that President Obama wants to be among the first who takes the COVID vaccine. But I think it's going to take a lot more than that. And I think it's going to take people on the local level, specifically on the local level, both church leaders and community leaders, groups like the Breakfast Club and others who are going to have to step up and say, we're willing to take this risk. And I think much of this is going to depend on relationships. And it's going to depend on the trust that already exists between medical professionals and particularly in the Black community or Black communities, because like I said, you have the immigrant Black community, you have many factors within the local long-term resident Black community. So it's going to take identifying the key people who are decision makers and influencers within those communities, and really getting them on board. And I have questions about the vaccine myself, quite honestly. We hear things about how the East Coast has a different strain of the vaccine than the West Coast does. And, since this is RNA based, is it going to address both kinds, or am I going to have to get another vaccine later on? I mean, there are lots of detailed questions that the general public has not been privy to the answers to. So I think it's going to take that kind of thing. I know that this evening, it's 7 o'clock. I'm not sure if it's local time or East Coast time, but Dr. Fauci is having an open conversation with the Black community about COVID-19. And I'm sure he will also address the vaccine in that process. So I just think there are lots of questions.
Absolutely. And my COVID question of you, John, the pandemic has hit everybody so hard, especially on the employment front. City of Seattle is looking to inject $5 million in grants to support small businesses. Downtown Seattle Association, citing more than 140 downtown businesses have closed recently. Last month, John, you questioned whether new restrictions put in place by the governor will make a big difference. What do you see as being the thing that will make the difference?
I think the restrictions that were announced back in November are absolutely necessary as we face a frightening third wave of cases here in Seattle and across King County. What's unfortunate is that we haven't seen the federal government act to provide additional relief, but beyond what was acted upon back in the spring. And that has resulted in, across Seattle, more than 200 small brick and mortar businesses that have announced permanent closures. These are folks that aren't going to reopen when restrictions are lifted. They're gone forever. And that's more than 150 in downtown Seattle. These are folks that have been in business for decades in many cases and are really sort of the fabric of our great community. So The state, I think, has done what it's needed to do on the health front. There's been some investment in relief. I'd like to see more, but the scale of this economic crisis really demands and requires additional federal action and relief. And as we noted earlier, we've been in this longer than anybody across the country. The urban core of Seattle has felt the effects really beginning on March 5th. So our arts community, culture community, small business, retail, restaurant, hospitality, they've been dealing with this much longer than many other communities, the economic effects much longer than other communities around the country. And we will see more closures over the next weeks and months, absent any additional federal aid.
Well, you talk about federal aid, the federal government. We, of course, the other big story of 2020, we just came off an election. This country is clearly divided on so many levels. Lola, I have a question for you from Julie. She wants to know, how can we listen or accept those who are clearly on the other side of the political divide? It's a big question, but if I could have you try your best to sum that up in just about a minute. I apologize, but how do we talk to the other side? We are so polarized right now. And some people standing their ground saying, I refuse to move.
I'm not sure I'm the right person to ask that question because I'm not the person who's not willing to move. I guess the short answer for me is a phrase. It's a quote, and it's peace without justice is tyranny. And so I think we often seek to find peace without dealing with the issues that create injustice. So if you want me to be quiet, then deal with the issues that I'm talking about. And once those issues are dealt with, I promise to be quiet. I really do. I don't want to be yelling about issues. I really don't. But I will, as long as those issues are not dealt with.
Well, we don't want you to be quiet. Lots of folks depend on hearing your voice and your advice and your sage wisdom. I have so many more questions, but I need to keep the program moving. So what we're going to do now is go to our rapid response. Dr. Gupta, and then just the first thing that comes to your mind, each of the panelists, what local issue did not get enough attention this year?
Say at least initially, I'm on the board of directors of Northwest Harvest. I would say food insecurity has ramped up in attention, but perhaps even more focus on food insecurity.
Alyssa.
First thing that comes to mind is the incredible number of people that are unhoused right now. I live in the downtown area. I come into the office, I interact with folks, and people are in a time of crisis, and we need to do a better job of taking care of the people that are on this, that don't have homes right now.
Lola.
I would say domestic violence, although we're starting to see more attention paid to that, particularly for children who are in vulnerable homes where there might be domestic violence going on around them. There needs to be some psychological support. And I have to also say, there are also artists who are, or people in the arts who are definitely not getting any attention at all. The stage hands and people like that who no one pays attention to them at all, and they're going to be out of work for a long time.
All right, John.
+1 to Alyssa's, the homeless humanitarian crisis playing out on the streets of Seattle.
All right, and we're going to go in reverse order. In one word, what received too much attention, John, in terms of news coverage?
Disagreement.
Lola.
The current president.
Alyssa.
That was mine. And I would also say opinion over science.
All right, Dr. Gupta.
Hydroxychloroquine.
All right, that was a word that took some of us a while to learn how to pronounce. Unfortunately, it's become part of our vernacular as the issue of misinformation, disinformation continues. That is another major issue facing us in 2020. Moving on to the next subject, Black Lives Matter. On top of the pandemic, we came face to face with this racial reckoning. The last words of George Floyd, Alyssa, as you mentioned, being in Minneapolis at the time of his death, "I can't breathe." We have Manny Ellis in Tacoma locally. Tragically, these cases are breathing new life into an age-old demand for justice. Seattle took its place in the national spotlight. Council members responding to calls for change that some say backfired with the early retirement of Seattle Police Chief, former Chief Carmen Best, the first Black woman to lead the SPD. And of course, we have the big local news from yesterday. Be sure to submit your questions right now. And this is a question that's really buzzing in our chat room or in our Q&A board right now. John, I'm going to ask you, since we have you in real time, your reaction to Mayor Jenny Durkan saying she is not seeking re-election. Did you see that coming?
I think she made a really tough but significant decision that's going to be good for our city, and I think help our city come together, allow her to focus on running city government and helping to rebuild our economy and continue to keep all of us healthy and make sure as a community we're doing what we need to be doing as the vaccine is distributed. So I think it's a notable decision and one that is likely going to be looked back on as a good one for the health of the city of Seattle long term. Any stab at who may try to replace her? I think there'll be many folks in this race.
All right. Lola, Chris has a question. It says, you've been critical about Mayor Durkan asking for her resignation. Seattle had a highly credentialed lesbian mayor and an experienced Black female police chief going into the 2020 crisis. Exactly how were their collective judgments insufficient in your mind?
So I never asked for her resignation. Let's be clear about that. What I did say was that what we need right now, what the city needs, what the region needs, are people who are trailblazers, people who are willing to go look beyond what has been done before, and are willing to find new ways, new paths for us to travel. Because we know already that all the old paths lead to the same place. And I really would like to not come back to this same place again. So my critique of Mayor Durkan was that she's not a trailblazer. She does not have the vision nor the experience nor the skill to get us off of the paths that we've traveled before. I wrote that because I really wanted her to prove me wrong. I really wanted her to show that she actually had that capacity to go beyond what the normal political responses are in our town and to find a new path. And people have been sketching out new paths and saying, let's take this one. This one will get us in a different place. And what we've seen is her repeatedly going down the same paths over and over and over again. And so my hope is that in this time that's coming forward, now that she's not running for election, I'm hoping that she will show that she has a capacity that she hasn't shown so far, that she'll let go of the constraints that have held her back. That is my fantasy, that there have been constraints holding her back from fulfilling her true identity. And so I'd love to see her show that. I just don't see it happening. And so that's what I would look for. That's what I want in whoever's coming up next.
Mind you, she is facing or had faced something in a time that few members in leadership have had to face collectively, dealing with the pandemic, dealing with the Black Lives Matter movement. So many things on her plate, but we hear your points. And Chris, thank you for that question. I'm going to keep pressing and moving forward. I apologize to not dig deeper into some of these topics, but another big thing that came down yesterday was a federal judge ruled the SPD was in contempt of violating a previous order over the summer. They banned officers from using pepper spray, blast balls, other crowd control techniques. Let me ask you this, Alyssa. What would you like to see state and county level legislators pass in the wake of racial injustice protests we've seen this year?
It's a very difficult question. I will take a stab at it. I think we need to deal with the injustices that are occurring in our police system. And I want to share with folks that my father was a police officer, and I was a co-foster parent with a police officer. And so I am very aware of the challenges in the community that my community has experienced at the hands of police officers. And I think we have to talk about this in a way that is truthful about the impacts of where we invest dollars. When we invest everything heavily in one place, things suffer. And a lot of what is happening in our communities are not issues where the police need to get involved. They are issues where mental health support is needed, where we need to turn to somebody because we're experiencing domestic violence or we are experiencing a mental health issue. And that is not the place for police officers to be at. So we do need to deal with how we invest in support systems for community, and in particular, young people. We need to invest in young people in very real ways. They are leaders right now. They have been instrumental. They are leading the climate movement in so many ways. We need to listen to them. If they're asking for support services, if this is what they want, then we should be willing to listen to them and trust their leadership. I think that is a really key thing with what's happening in all communities of colors. We need to trust the leadership that comes out of community. And if folks are saying we need to reinvest dollars into mental health support, into programs for young people, into educational opportunities, then let's make that investment. Because if we don't invest with them and we don't invest for them, we will have a lot of challenges because they are going to hold us accountable in ways that I think we don't even know yet. I expect it and I welcome it because I think that's what needs to happen. But I think that they are a force to be reckoned with, and we really need to listen.
Well, Alyssa, you mentioned investments, and the Seattle City Council passing the 2021 budget, a $6.5 billion package. It has some investments in BIPOC communities, also some changes when it comes to homeless issues, addressing such, and of course, the police budget being cut by 18%. John, let me ask you this. Your organization has expressed concerns about some of the changes social groups have called for when it comes to policing. What arguments have you heard from the other side that you think are legitimate, and how can we work to address them in such a way that we're doing something other than just arguing at one another?
Yeah, the status quo is not acceptable when it comes to policing, both in our community and across the country. We need to reform and reimagine policing, but we need to do it in a way that actually delivers results, both keeping our communities safe across our city, but also reducing violence against Black lives. And you know, as a community, we've embraced data and science and how we've combated this pandemic. We need to do the same thing in how we approach reimagining policing. So one thing I would look at is across the state having transparent and consistent rules around discipline. We have that for doctors, medical professionals, truck drivers, contractors that are building your home. We have a patchwork when it comes to police officers and police departments for how individuals are disciplined and held accountable and where that information is available. So I think there are significant things that we can do as a community, that the city ought to be doing, that the state ought to be doing around reform and reimagining policing. And we ought to focus on those things that are actually going to make a difference. I think some of the decisions that have been made are much more symbolic, and we'll be back here months or years from now with some of the same challenges because we haven't been thoughtful enough about the real outcomes we're trying to achieve. And I think that's absolutely critical if we hope to address both community safety and also reducing violence against Black lives.
So how do you think we're going to emerge from this time? To quote Marcus Green of the Seattle Times and the South Seattle Emerald, he wrote, "Will we return to our regularly scheduled racism?" Lola, let me ask you this. Do you think we're actually going to see the city advance the discussion on race, or are we going to continue to partake in what some have deemed transactional activism?
That is such a good question. I wish I had the answer to it. I think a lot of it depends on the type of leadership that we choose to follow. And, and I don't mean that as just necessarily elected leadership. I mean community leadership. My fear is the same as Marcus's, that we will return to here, we'll give you this if you'll just go away and leave us alone kind of actions. And we've seen some of that.
What, for example?
Rather than really digging down deep and going after the root changes that need to be made. Yeah.
All right. Dr. Gupta, there are so many issues facing our country, and you mentioned a few that are of concern to you. What do you see as being the big sleeper issue that is going to wake us up once we deal with the pandemic, or at least get it under, I can't say necessarily control, but in such a way that we can manage to move about into our daily lives and our routine? What's the big sleeper event facing us?
Well, I'll stay on the topic, and I'll just reference that right now. I know this is going to change likely in 45 days. Right now, the big sleeper issue is we don't have a plan. I hate to even use this phrase; it's going to cause people just to get even more fatigued. But what happens for the next epidemic or the next pandemic? We are not engaged with the World Health Organization. There's something called the COVAX facility. It's basically the COVID Vaccine Alliance that's organized by the WHO, that's funded by 172 countries. We're not a part of that. And we don't have priority access to the vaccines that are coming through that pipeline. And so global engagement on pandemic preparedness, the overlap of pandemic preparedness with climate and environmental justice, the two are linked. I think I get asked this all the time as a lung doc. Hey, doc, what happens if I'm inhaling terrible air from wildfire smoke in addition to the chronic exposure to COVID-19? What does that mean, and how should I protect myself? These are all issues that cannot be approached as a nation of one, but as a community of nations. So we need that. To me, is the big sleeper issue, is our lack of global engagement, needing to play catch up across a range of these issues. And I'll lastly say, and the most important thing for the next 10 years, I'm sure nobody needs a reminder here, but we've had 4 epidemics: Zika, H1N1, Ebola, you name it. Now, obviously, the one pandemic here with COVID-19 in just the last 8 to 9 years. We're going to be facing another biological threat of natural origin. What we need to be thinking about is access, in my view, to basic things for everybody, like high quality masking. I'm so tired of having to advocate for, don't do the neck gaiter, wear a 3-ply blue mask, which is, frankly, is just not sufficient for people. Everybody deserves protective wear, the same that the grocery store clerk deserves the same protective wear as I do in the ICU. And we just don't have that infrastructure in place. So the big sleeper issue to me is engagement in the global arena, and then actually planning about what the next set of threats are from a biological standpoint. So the next time around, we don't have to shutter our economy for 12 to 18 months.
Well, since we're still dealing with now, Dr. Gupta, should a vaccine be mandated for the public good?
It's a tough question. So my heart says one thing, my head says another. So I would say my heart says let's just save lives, and let's do it as quickly as possible. So that's just getting the vaccine in the arms of everybody as quickly as possible, and ideally just mandating it. My head says, well, obviously, for the reasons that other panelists have already mentioned, there's a lot of distrust. The fact of the matter is that 9 in 10 individuals in the Pfizer vaccine trial were not members of communities of color. Mm-hmm. So now we're saying, well, hey, now take this vaccine. It's going to protect you, without actually building a data set to convince communities of color that these vaccines are safe for them. That's an obstacle. And so I would say there's a public health argument to be made about mandating the vaccine for one's own health, for the health of the community, for mental health. But then there's the obvious obstacles that exist in terms of how we've gone about vaccine development quickly, and we have to overcome those.
All right. Dr. Gupta, I want to thank you ahead of time in case you do have to drop out. We understand that you have you are once again a man in demand. So thank you for your time and your expertise. We do appreciate that. John, let me throw this next question to you. What initiatives do you want to see Seattle prioritize as the city rebuilds post-COVID? This question coming from Elizabeth, who is watching online.
Housing homelessness and getting treatment to those that have behavioral health issues on our streets. This is a crisis on top of a crisis that has only been worsened and become more pronounced because of the pandemic and the right decisions to limit shelter capacity to stop the spread of coronavirus. But we haven't moved as a city with great enough urgency to really meet the problem, which is a significant number of folks in our community dealing with substance use disorder and mental illness. And the streets and parks and sidewalks of Seattle, in many ways, have become our community's largest mental health facility. But without any treatment available, without any walls or roofs or hygiene or bathrooms. But that's our harsh reality today, is that the largest mental health facility is our streets and our park system.
And the concern growing as eviction moratoriums are set to expire at the end of this month. All right, going to move on to another round of rapid response. And I've got a few questions here. We're going to try to get through as many as possible. We've got about 10 minutes left in our panel discussion. Again, thank you to everyone who sent in questions. I've done my best to get them to those whom you've asked me to ask them of. First, rapid response question for you, Alyssa. What was your strongest visual image of the year?
Oh, that's a great question. I am a photographer, so I see the whole world through an image of photos. For me, being in the downtown area where I live, the biggest visual thing that I've been seeing, and I'm constantly looking, is just how dramatically it's changed in such a short time. And I know John spoke about businesses that have shut down. I see it. There's a business there one day, and I was trying to support one, and the next day it was gone. And that to me is striking, how quickly things have changed in the downtown area from a visual perspective.
John, the visual image for you in 2020?
The murder of George Floyd, no doubt.
All right. Lola?
A friend of mine, Tandy Williams, put an image up on Facebook, and it is of a Christmas tree that is wearing a surgical outfit with a COVID, with a mask and gloves and a hat and booties. And I thought, yep, there it is. There's our year in a nutshell right there.
That does paint a picture and says a lot. Alyssa, what movie, song, book, or show got you through this time? Very quickly.
I watch a lot of Netflix and Hulu and all of that. I think it's called Little Fires Everywhere. It's a show on Hulu. I think that's what it's called. And it is about, it has a lot to do with conversations about race. And it could be Little Fires Everywhere, All the Fires Everywhere. I don't know. It blew my mind, and I think everybody should watch it.
All right, Lola, what song, movie, show got you through this year?
Star Trek everything. Star Trek for me is the world that I want to live in. And so Star Trek everything.
A lot of people probably agree with you, want to be somewhere else right about now.
Exactly.
John, how about you?
I would just say music in general. I'm a huge music fan, a huge fan of live music. I've missed the ability to go to shows. So I have music playing just about everywhere I am all the time. So music has been key.
What good thing happened in 2020? Lola, let me throw this one at you first.
Oh, wow. Wow. There are lots of good things that happened in 2020. So the publication of a book called Spirited Stone, Lessons from Kubota's Garden, which is a collection of wonderful stories and poems and photographs related to Kubota Garden in Rainier Beach. And I just, it's such a beautiful work and something that I find really invigorating and inspiring as well. So Yeah.
How about you, Alyssa? Good thing in 2020.
2020, I think for me is a reconnection with the outdoors for a lot of people. I camped 31 nights this year and really would much prefer to be on the outside doing that than being on the inside looking at a computer screen. But I think for me, that was just like, I forgot how much I love the outdoors and I just wanted to hug everything, all the trees, wanted to hug my friends. But that reconnection to nature has been super, super important, I think, for everybody.
All right, well, it may be a while before we can hug our friends again, but a tree we can wrap our arms around. John, how about you?
I think the increase of vulnerability in the workplace, certainly true for our organization, but I think true for many others as well, as we are all just humans dealing with this pandemic, first and foremost, before we're employees or employers. And so just the amount of vulnerability that is now part of conversations among teams and in organizations that maybe wasn't there before, where we had brighter lines between work and home. And I think it's really necessary for organizations that are early on in their journey to address systemic racism like us, to be able to bring that vulnerability and grief and pain and those conversations into your workplace so that you can be much more effective in taking steps and actions as a private company or a nonprofit organization to address systemic racism in the pursuit of your mission or your business venture.
All right, in one word, how would you sum up your social media feed? Alyssa.
Yoga.
Okay, wasn't expecting that one, but that works. Lola?
Wow. Varied.
Okay, and John?
Predictable.
Predictable. In a wild year, okay. We did have this last question, and we kind of talked about it before, but using the phrasing of this attendee who's watching online, Seattle has been a proud progressive leader for decades, but we find ourselves riddled with problems. Why do we have confidence that our thought leaders are guiding us to do the right thing in this moment? That is not directed toward anyone specifically. So, Alyssa, I'm going to let you have a stab at that.
Right. I guess when I hear the term proud progressive leader, that to me doesn't say proud progressive person of color. I think that term right there speaks to a community that doesn't reflect me. So perhaps what a challenge is with the progressive community is we're not actually listening to people of color. And I think we lift up, in some cases, leaders that don't speak for community, don't represent community, don't have roots. And we need to shift that because we really need to walk the talk about centering BIPOC voices. And that is a monumental shift for an organization that I'm a part of. That means change. And I think we need to be authentic in that change, be vulnerable in that change, and be bold.
John, let me ask you this question also from a viewer this afternoon. In the polarized society we live in now, do you believe public debates are still important for elected officials to participate in?
Yeah, absolutely. I think we need more of them, not less. And I appreciate the work that CityClub does to facilitate that. We need more diverse ideologies going at it and in respectful and considerate ways, I think, to get to the best ideas.
All right. And the final viewer question, Lola, I'm going to save for you. What is the one action an individual can take to improve life in our community?
One thing, pay attention, read, view, and go outside your comfort zone. Listen to people who are not like you. Find out why they believe what they believe, what's behind their belief system. And just be present, do something, go beyond your current boundaries and be afraid, be fine to be afraid.
Okay. Let's see here. We have one last round of rapid response, and then we are going to wrap it up. I've got 3 questions for you. Alyssa, who is your hero of the year?
My hero of the year. Wow, I can't pin it on one person. The people that I have been so inspired are all of the people who have gone out into the streets and raised the roof, raised the awareness, continued to get out there and did not stop. And those are a lot of young people. I am inspired by the youth and the incredible work that they are doing to keep issues at the forefront.
John, what is your one? Who is your hero of the year?
Our healthcare workers that are in the worst part of the storm right now, and the forecast isn't a good one. So definitely our healthcare workers.
And your hero, Lola, for 2020?
I'm actually going to pick one person, and that is Omari Salisbury.
All right. And then finally, we have the last question. I know I said 3, but we are short on time now. What is your one prediction for next year? And mind you, we have this on tape, so or on video, I should say. I'm dating myself by saying tape. Let's kind of go in reverse, mix the order up a little bit. John.
The office is not dead. We return to the office.
Wow. Okay. Alyssa.
The office is not dead, but it looks very different from what it looks like right now. And I think we will lean into a healthier balance between work and personal life. And what I predict is that offices will look like hybrids of what we're experiencing now and what was in the past.
And Lola, your prediction for 2021?
So I think that we will continue to perfect the art of dancing on Jell-O. Really trying to figure out how to balance in the midst of chaos.
All right. Well, there is so much more to cover, but unfortunately we have this thing called the clock that we must battle. But I would like to thank all of our distinguished panelists for joining us this afternoon. Dr. Vin Gupta, thank you for your time this afternoon. Alyssa Macy, thank you as well. Lola Peters, John Scholes, your voice is so important as we continue to try to move forward as a collective, as a city, as a community.
Thank you.
And also a big thanks to Seattle City Club for providing us this venue to reflect on a year that, man, like I said, fill in the blank, find your word for 2020, and let's move into 2021 with hope. All right, at this time, I'd like to hand things back over to Whitney Keys.
Thank you, Angela. We do appreciate all of you panelists. And Angela, thank you for facilitating this conversation for us. And I know I'm very excited about 2021. Speaking of that, I hope that you'll all join us. Actually, exactly 1 month from today on Friday, January 8th, we're going to have our legislative preview where you'll hear firsthand from our leadership in Washington State's legislature. So I've got just a couple more minutes of updates. Please hang in there with us. Before I wrap up, I have one favor to ask. As soon as you leave this program, a short survey is going to pop up in your web browser, and it would mean so much to us if you would just take a moment, share your feedback. You can provide some additional values and ideas for us to consider as we move forward next year. Thanks to everyone who made this event a success, especially my incredible team, Amanda, Casey, Jeff, Alex, Cam, and Christina. You're phenomenal. Couldn't do this without you. And on behalf of Seattle City Club, thanks to all of you for spending your lunch hour with us. Have a great afternoon, a wonderful rest of the year, and we'll see you in 2021. Thanks, everyone.